Hello everyone, and welcome back to yet another edition to my journey through One Piece. Today we're going to be talking about the really interesting Thriller Bark arc. This is honestly one of the most interesting arcs to talk about in the series, and I have quite a bit to say about it, so this will probably be a pretty big video. Bigger than I thought it would be, at least, after starting it for the first few chapters. It's a really interesting arc to talk about, for which I think opinions vary a lot, so please feel free to share your own, especially for this one, because I really am interested in a lot of opinions on this one specifically because of all the different ways in which it can appeal to some, or in other ways may not appeal to others, or a bit of both. So yeah, please let me know as you guys have been doing. I do have to thank you guys. These videos have consistently been getting lots of comments, lots of feedback, lots of thoughts, insights, AJP's comments, whatever, and I really do appreciate it because whether it be in Twitch chat or in these comments on these videos, it really helps to enhance my immersion with the series, my investment, and my appreciation overall. So thank you for that. And yeah, feel free to continue. I really appreciate it. And I do read every single comment, except for the AJP's comments, which I read fresh in the future video. But before we talk about the arc itself, just want to let you guys know, if you want to watch my review on the next arc, which will be the Sabaody Archipelago, you can do so by pledging to my Patreon, where you can get full early access to the next video under the $5 tier. You can follow my Twitch, where we'll be working through the chapters. Every single chapter is read live, and it's always an amazing time, and it's been awesome lately, so thank you for that, and long may it continue. We're about to hit the 500 chapter mark, which is huge, and we're going to be having a stream about that. But yeah, so you can follow me on Twitch, pledge on Patreon if you want to watch the next video right after this one, and you can check out the Discord server, where there's tons of fun to be had, discussion about One Piece, my streams, anime in general, video games in general, whatever you want to talk about. With all that out of the way, as always, we will be talking about this video's AJP's comments. Just so you know, these will be referring to comments made on the Enies Lobby Part 1 video, so basically ending with I Want to Live. The first one is from Soga King Sniper, beautiful name, who says, if you were to consider post Enies Lobby to be an arc, what would the score be, or where would it rank in the series? It would be a light 9, and probably just below Arlong Park. Roughly on par with Arlong Park, honestly. Maybe a bit below due to not having a full internal comprehensive narrative, but it is so good. Like I said, I love those really dense, transitionary, world-building, functional arcs that do all these sorts of things for all sorts of characters. The next one is from Bayonord, who is a frequent supporter of the streams. So this is the arc that I've completely fell in love with One Piece. One of the reasons being, this is the arc that Oda drops all pretense. For a long time, basically since chapter 1, we as readers were meant to believe that this is a lighthearted, optimistic story in a wacky, whimsical world of idealism. But as the story progresses, Oda drops small hints about the true nature of this world and the story. Just for the nature of time, I'm not going to read the entire comment, and it's going to be up on the screen right now so you can pause if you'd like to. But here Bayonord goes on to explain a lot of the ways in which the world, we slowly see that this setting is corrupt, that the government has their hands in everything, that there are all sorts of weird contradictions going on all over the place, and all that sort of thing. And then concludes with, the reader doesn't really see the world government and Marines as a malicious entity, just incompetent and easily exploited by bad actors. And then this saga begins, through Frankie and Robin's flashback, and through CP9, Spandam, and Lucci, and through what Professor Clover says about the Ancient Kingdom, it finally clicks. The world's government is an evil empire that has taken over the entire planet, nearly, brutally crushed the opposition, and through propaganda and overwhelming military force, enforces its rule, claiming it is the only true representative of justice, law, and order, and that anyone who opposes them must be a demon. You've been reading a dystopia this entire time. So that's a really interesting point of view. There are definitely parts of it that I agree with, and parts of it that I'm not so sure that I entirely agree with, but from what I've read in the comments, there are a lot of people who tend to agree with this point of view, and I can see why for sure. There are lots of dystopic elements. This world at large is controlled by this corrupt entity that has, like I said, like Bayonord said, their fingers in everything. They plot through everything, and nothing seems to be totally free. However, at the same time, at this moment in time, end of Thriller Bark, I've read a couple of chapters of Sabaody Archipelago, so nearly 500 chapters. At this moment, I still think that it is a optimistic, whimsical, and honestly mostly idealistic story. I don't really think my opinion on that has shifted, and Unless it really changes a lot upcoming and pretty soon, I don't think it will shift. So I think that it's dystopic in content for a lot of the reasons described there. But at the same time, it'll be interesting to see if I end up agreeing that it's dystopic in tone. Because yeah, if you look at the facts, regardless of whether it's a full dystopia, it is very dystopic in a lot of ways. It probably is a full-blown dystopia, actually. But in terms of tone, not so much for me. It doesn't feel like a dystopic story because of the optimism, idealism, sense of adventure, and freedom that's imbued into it through Oda's thematic pinnings and the nature of Luffy as a character and the Straw Hats and what they stand for. So it's a really interesting perspective that I'm really glad I read, and it'll be cool to see how my opinion on it changes over time, my relationship with that theory or concept or interpretation, because at the moment, I'm kind of like halfway there. Like, I'm there in terms of content. In tone, I have to see how it progresses. Thank you for the comment. That was really cool to read. Bobby Tran, a patron, also Bayanort was a patron as well, so thank you, both of you. And Soga King was a patron as well. Wow, the first 3 are from patrons. Thank you so much, guys. Bobby Tran says, quite a few things, a lot of which are very interesting and important. The main thing, though, that I want to stress here is I wanted to talk about the importance of masks in Water 7 because one of the first sights the Straw Hats see when they enter the city is the presence of the citizens wearing masks everywhere. This is not only foreshadowing for the many secret identity reveals that will play out in the arc, nor is it just planting the seed for the setup for how Iceberg's assassins would be dressed, it's also a metaphor for how everyone in this arc has multiple, sometimes secret identities, one on the outside and one on the inside. Frankie, the public criminal boss that protects the city from pirate attacks, is secretly Cutty Flam, apprentice of Tom and peer to Iceberg, the city's illegal boss. The dynamic of Usopp/Soga King as well, and the CP9 agents disguising themselves as loyal shipwrights are other more obvious examples of multiple identities and characters wearing masks to serve a personal purpose, etc. And then, like I said, there are lots of other points made here, all of which I think are really interesting, but that's the one I wanted to draw attention to specifically. And that's really cool, because I don't think I mentioned that as a main thematic point or motif of the arc of Water 7 and Ys Lobby, but it's true. It's there from the very beginning, aesthetically, and then evolves to symbolically characterize a lot of the things that go on. With the plot, with our characters, with how we view plot events and characters, and our perspective and how that shifts. The whole idea of masks and how that can change perspectives in-universe and metatextually is really interesting, so thank you for bringing that to my attention as well, Bobby. And honestly, I think if you apply it in other abstract ways, you can use it on other characters as well. For example, Spandam. He's this pathetic, absolute loner who tries to wear this brittle mask of a hero, but it's so, like I said, brittle, it's so thin that everyone sees right through it and no one respects it. So there's lots of interesting ways you can take that. That might be a bit of a stretch, but just something I came up with on the spot. And it's really cool, so thank you again. Tyler Beckley says, just a thought on Robin's comments about seeing people's lives on maps. I think this comment has an extra layer due to her being an archaeologist/historian. In the study of history, especially ancient history, we often only get bits and pieces of documentation. It's the job of the historians to weave the pieces together and tell their most likely interpretation of the way life was from the tools available. But try as they might, they can never know the full story. There will always be some amount of guesswork, inference, and speculation. Robin, having this background, is keenly aware of this and therefore also aware of the things that aren't and can't be recorded on maps. That's a really interesting little tidbit with regards to Robin that I didn't think of as well, so thank you for pointing it out. Yeah, Robin, more than anyone, at least in the series right now that are alive, rest in peace, O'Hara, is so keenly aware of what it means to not be able to understand the heart of the matter, just through some documents, just through some maps. Because as someone who studied this, she knows that there are things you have to do, guesswork, inferences. You won't be able to see the full heart and the full emotional spectrum of the events that occurred unless you really desperately try to be empathetic and put yourself in that situation. And even when you do, you can never understand the full scope. So Robin has known that throughout her learning in her fledgling years up until she was 8, and knows it even more because of what happened to O'Hara, because of how other people's talk about it. And you merge that with what she knows about being a historian, being an archaeologist, it just makes total sense that she would be able to communicate that no one will be able to understand what happened that day unless you lived it. And same with all sorts of tragedies. And now we have one from Nadid. Lucci was only following orders from Spandam. Unlike Spandam, Lucci is not corrupted. He just follows every order even if he doesn't like his superior. If his superior was a good person, maybe he'd have done better things. In that way, he is the evil that he keeps talking about. He's so concerned that someone will use Robin to make ancient weapons, but he doesn't realize that he himself is being used to cause evil. That is so cool. It's like the same theme you were discussing in Water 7. That is so cool, and that gives me an elevated appreciation of Lucci, honestly. That is awesome. Thank you so much for pointing that out, Nadid, because yes, the very thing that they're doing here, and the logic from which they perch on their lofty position and say, we are doing this for the good of all, for justice, because these weapons cannot be wielded by people with horrible intent. Lucci has no real complexion on the act that's being carried out. He just carries it out. He is a tool in that way. He is a weapon. And we can talk about the morality of that all day. Personally, I think that that doesn't exempt him from anything. But nonetheless, thematically, if you look at it in that way, that's so interesting because there's a hypocrisy there. There is an element of you are that weapon that can't be wielded. Just like you are saying that Robin's knowledge cannot be wielded, you are just as destructive, and you are being wielded by one of the worst people in this setting in Spandam. So the way it reflects back on Lucci in that way, that element of hypocrisy, is a really cool layer. I'll be thinking about that for a while. Thank you so much. That is really, really clever. Last couple here. First is from Peter Blade Strzok. Please let me know if I mispronounced that, Peter. Not sure if you noticed it, but it's an interesting tidbit to keep in your mind for possible future speculations. Enni's Lobby is a place where the day is eternal. Funny, since you're currently playing through Shadowbringers. It's right there. The night never falls, and there's also a huge crater under the island. Many of us have been speculating about what that could mean. And we also finally found out about the prosperous ancient kingdom. Since the world government united to stand against it, you start to ask yourself if they were the bad guys all along, or if the world government started as a good idea to perhaps win back their freedom from the ancient kingdom, but eventually fell into the temptation of power and luxury and ended up the same or worse. But it may also be that the ancient kingdom was a utopia, which also makes you question, why did anyone ever really want to rise up against them? Really interesting stuff. Enni's Lobby being an island of eternal day may also tie into it. Yeah, there are all sorts of directions that you can take theorizing about that sort of thing. In terms of the crater underneath it, that is something that I found... It isn't something that I really thought about narratively a ton in terms of what it could mean for the lore or backstory of the world or of Enni's Lobby or anything. It's just something that I think added this really cool element of this is the end of the world to Enni's Lobby. This element of scope and threat and like, holy shit, this is huge. So I noted the crater for that reason, but in terms of what it means for the overall narrative, that's something I have to think more about. Maybe if we get more and more hints along the way, that's something we could integrate into why there could be a crater there. I mean, I don't think this applies directly to it, but we've seen in a cover story someone who fell from the sky from Skypiea causing a crater. Could that be similar origin? Could it be from the moon? No clue. I don't think that... I mean, I just came up with that right now, so I don't think it applies. It's probably a huge illogical leap. But nonetheless, it's something that I'll be keeping an eye on for sure. It's interesting to think about and the implications it could have for the world government right now. Did they start off as these awful people with awful motives, or did they start off with the best of motivations? Was it a slippery slope as they combated this ancient kingdom and the people opposing them? I think either way, it props them up as really interesting. Either way, I think if they were always this way, it shows how deeply rooted this corruption and darkness and evil is, and as such, kind of makes them feel more oppressive, more authoritative, more powerful, and really makes them more fearsome if they were always like this. But then again, if they started out with good intentions of freedom and maybe freeing the world from some sort of tyranny or oppression, that kind of foils a little bit with our protagonistic crew and adds a little bit of a bittersweet melancholic tinge to the world government, as in, yes, they absolutely have to be stopped right now, but that's a bit cautionary, isn't it? That is a bit of a warning of that slippery slope nature, something our protagonists would do well to keep in mind. As they get more and more influence in the world, the responsibility grows more and more, and you can't lose sight of that responsibility and the burden, which they don't really look at as a burden, but nonetheless it can be, of being this power, this central power. They're not it yet, but as they grow in notoriety and pirates band around them, they're going to be looking to them for guidance. and so that makes it even more clear that Luffy has to keep a clear mind. Don't lose sight of your goals or your ideals, and I think he's with a great crew to do that, Zoro in particular. But it's interesting to see if they'll slip on that path towards becoming that power, becoming that central. Really interesting, thank you for the comment. And the last one from this video is from Reaper. In the scene with Kaku and Khalifa eating their devil fruits, there was another translation which states that if you were to eat 2 devil fruits, there would be 2 devils inside of you fighting for control until eventually you get torn apart. I do remember something along those lines. I think I remarked upon it. Theoretically, these fruits could have their own will, imposing onto Khalifa and Kaku, making them change the way they fight and act. It especially shows with Khalifa. Her personality is extremely hard to read while she's Iceberg's secretary. However, from that section, her break-in in the Gali Law office, and her brief actions on the sea train, it's clear that she's extremely decisive and powerful, quite willing to get her hands dirty, and talented with a unique thorn whip. However, after eating her devil fruit, her fights with Sanji and Nami are comical. She never wields her whip, she really cuts down on her Rokoshiki moves, relying primarily on the gimmicky devil fruit rather than simply kicking both of them to death. Her personality changes drastically after eating her devil fruit, and not for the better. She becomes much more arrogant than before, and it ends with her getting bested by Nami. Kaku also becomes more inclined to argue with Jabra rather than focusing on his foes, contrasted by his previous self in Water 7, a more efficient assassin. You can also take note from other personalities of characters who have eaten devil fruits. There are so many great examples of this, and it only fuels this unique and almost comical power system to feel well integrated and believable in this already absurd world. That's really interesting and something that I really hadn't thought about. Again, thank you for bringing that to my attention. That's a really cool interpretation. The idea of devil fruits changing people. I don't think that's a blanket statement. I don't think that's something that happens all the time. So I don't think it's a one-size-fits-all sort of thing. Not saying that you are saying that, Reaper, but it's interesting that there is a possibility that it could affect personalities in that way. And I mean, you're right. Kaku and Khalifa, their personalities very much change in Enies Lobby compared to Water 7. I talked about it in my video. I talked about how I liked them less. I found them less interesting when they weren't these cold assassins. Not because, and some people have kind of pushed back on that, saying that it makes sense, it makes them more human, etc. And to be clear, my criticism there, my very slight criticism, it's hardly even a criticism, was not that it wasn't organic or didn't make sense, but that for the purpose of their role in the story, I just enjoyed it more when they were much more cold, cutthroat, brutal, ruthless. And we got additions to the crew in Jabra, Fukuro, etc., who are much more colorful, so that could have added that more whimsical element to them as well without changing how they functioned. In a way that I enjoyed less. So just to explain, I'm not going to get into that. I already talked about that. But just to explain, my problem isn't that it isn't organically integrated, it's just that I enjoy their presence as these cold assassins, ruthless, more. I think it makes them stick out more, makes them more distinct. But back to this comment, that's a really cool justification and in-universe reasoning for why they could have switched that way. And I think, honestly, I think I buy into it. And it's a really creative way of flipping characterization from Oda. So yeah, I think that's something I'll take in and apply and keep in mind for future situations where it might be applicable. But yeah, that is the last AJP's comment for the day, for the video. Thank you so much for sending them in. There were some great ones there, and I really appreciate it. And just a reminder, if you would like your comment to be highlighted in a future video for me to read it out like I just did, just be sure to use the hashtag AJPiece somewhere in the comments and it'll be entered into that pool. So Thriller Bark, what an interesting arc. There's so much to talk about with this one with regards to the actual events that happen and the things that it adds to the story, but also with regards to my experience with fan reception for it and what people tend to think about it. Before starting it, I had some people that were just like, I'm gonna have to drop out of the stream because this is my least favorite arc. I'll come back for a later arc, but I just wouldn't enjoy it that much. And I went, okay. I went, okay, that's fine. No hard feelings, whatever. No one's obligated to watch anything. Of course, it's all appreciated. But, so that made me go, that's really interesting and that excites me. Because there are some situations where my taste can be very mainstream and normie. You know, my favorite series of all time is Hunter x Hunter. Another one of my favorites is Haikyuu. Another one is Attack on Titan, Berserk, Breaking Bad, A Song of Ice and Fire. These are all series that are very mainstream, that are very well loved for great reasons, but, you know, I'm not going to pretend that I'm unique for loving them. But then on the other hand, in some cases, I tend to, when it comes to the specifics of those series, have some more unpopular opinions. For example, my thoughts on the character of Poof in Hunter x Hunter. At least it used to be quite a volatile opinion. I'm not a fan of JoJo's Bizarre Adventure. There are some other series that are very well acclaimed that just, I don't find that impressive, or they don't hit for me, or things like that. So the fact that it was so controversial made me excited, because it was either people saying, you know, it's one of my least favorite arcs, or the worst arc in One Piece, or people saying it's in my top 5 or top 8 or something like that, near the top. Some people even said top 2 or 3. And so that really excited me, because I'm like, this arc is going to do something really out there in one way or another, and I'm really here for it, and I'm really excited to see what I think about it, regardless of whether I love it or dislike it. And it turns out that, well, my overall thoughts on the arc are quite positive, very positive in fact, but it's interesting in that I think it's a great display of both the worst and best of One Piece, and I think you'll know my score for it at the end. It is a net positive. It is quite positive, meaning that I think it has much more positives than negatives in it, but you'd be hard-pressed to find anyone who doesn't agree that some of the stuff in this arc is kinda yikes. But we'll get there. So on the balance, really interesting arc, really great setting for it, this horrifying island, this horror island, but juxtaposing the horror imagery and classic horror tropes with silliness. There's a lot of silliness in this, and I've had some people clown on me a little bit for saying that this arc is lighthearted, at least in the first half or so, because it involves a character, Brooks, who experienced some horrible tragedy, and it is a bunch of zombies, people who've lost their lives, experiments on humans, and I had a couple people trying to clown on me because the subject matter is dark. But like, have you read this? This arc is extremely lighthearted. Subject matter does not dictate tone. I always say that. Just because a series may cover dark themes or dark subject matter that could be dark if it was approached in a certain way, that doesn't necessarily mean that story is dark. One Piece has all these dark things that happen in Thriller Bark, but could you count the amount of silly bone jokes? Could you count the amount of times where characters are talking about farting or pooping, or the puns, or the perversions? And we'll get to Brook as a character and why there is a dark tinge to a lot of the things he does because of his experiences. We'll get there for sure. And I acknowledge that a lot of those things that he does as a result of the years of loneliness he spent, just going kind of crazy, going kind of mad. But that doesn't take away from the fact that those scenes are nonetheless approached with slapstick. If he made those jokes and it was just kind of the tone in the moment of them was just kind of characters looking on and being like, oh, this guy's pathetic, without much humor, then yeah, I would have recontextualized it, look back, and it would have been quite a dark, sad arc overall. But it's not. There's so much slapstick, there's so much exaggeration, and it's lighthearted. It really is. Despite the setting, despite the horrifying tinge to it, it is lighthearted, at least for the first half. And I'll stick to that. And the thing I want to stress here is that some people tend to think that when someone says that an arc is lighthearted, that it's not dark, or that it's not complex, or that it's simpler. The complex, simple thing is a different subject entirely, but just for the sake of discussion, that doesn't necessarily mean that there's anything inherently wrong with that. When I say that a series is light, that's just me describing it as what I see the tone to be. But that isn't an insult towards it. There are series that are light that I love. I mentioned Haikyuu earlier. That is overwhelmingly light, optimistic, hopeful throughout. I've talked about One Piece in these very videos, how I love how idealistic it is. I have tons of comedies in my favorites. I have tons of lighthearted shows that I adore. So when I'm saying that something's light, that isn't an insult. It isn't inherently worse than something that's dark. So just wanted to get it out of the way. It's a really interesting discussion that I think bears some explanation for this arc. But yeah, back to what I said, this arc has some of the highest highs in the series. For example, the Laboon twist. I need to add a clip of that into this video, because I was floored. The friend we promised to meet again at the Cape is named... Oh my god! I might actually release a YouTube short of it, I'm not sure. But the Laboon twist, amazing. we'll get there. The Zoro stuff, I mean, I shouldn't even need to explain it. Brook's backstory, shouldn't need to explain that. And some really cool character work for Gecko Moria and how he foils our protagonists, especially Luffy. But then there's some bad stuff. There's some attempts at humor and just some poor use of very sensitive subject matter that is just very badly done, I think. And I was cringing in a very bad way through some of these chapters. There's some stuff about, like for example, Absalom, he's a waste of space. Honestly, you could take him out and the arc would be improved. Then there's some things about Sanji that I really didn't like. I'm sure you can imagine what. And I'll explain myself, of course. But then, of course, there are some things about Sanji that were great in this arc. And then there's some stuff about Brook, which I didn't like, but we'll get to that too. So it's really interesting. It's a really great display of the best of One Piece and the worst of One Piece. More best than worst, but nonetheless, and it's tied together by this really creative setting and this really cool aesthetic. I love the aesthetic here. It's very almost Soul Eater, if you've seen the anime for that. I've seen the color version of this, and it has this beautiful purple backdrop for contrast, which is so distinct from the rest of the series and gives Thriller Bark this amazing tone, very distinct, and sets the atmosphere and mood. And it's very gothic, but exaggerated cartoony at the same time. I really adore the aesthetic for Thriller Bark. And like I said, reminds me of Soul Eater, reminds me of some sort of Tim Burton-esque stuff, Nightmare Before Christmas. Yeah, and the lightheartedness, that's a word, really applies to it as well. Like I said, great recontextualization of earlier events through the revelations in this. Some awesome Straw Hat interactions. I do think it could have been shorter. I do think it was a bit too long. This ended up being close to 50 chapters, and I think it really could have been cut down a bit more focused. It is a little bloated, but nonetheless, I like Thriller Bark as a setting. Like I said, I think it's great, and overall I enjoyed. I love the tone, subject matter contrast. I love the character work for Zoro and Brook. There is dark and light working in tandem throughout for both characters, especially Brook. And what I think Oda does here that I didn't really talk about before is the Straw Hats are, by this point, One Piece was a phenomenon. Not as much as it is today, but it is a cultural icon of a story. And so the Straw Hats are our people. They are our protagonists, they are our nakama, they are our family. And so it really started dawning on me at this point, changing up the Straw Hats, as in taking away members, which hasn't happened yet. I don't know if it will, but either way, taking away members and adding members, there is a huge weight attached to that. You are changing the legacy, the overall, the family of everyone who watches or reads One Piece by shifting that. So there's a great amount of responsibility that I think comes with that, because there can be a sweet spot when it comes to the crew, in terms of it not having too many members and it having the perfect mix of personalities and backstories and kindred spirits. But there also comes to be a point where it could become too much. There could be too many members, where you kind of skew it out of balance by adding too much, whereas before you had the perfect balance with less crewmates. So I just want to say that by Oda continuously adding more characters, it's very courageous, it's very bold, because he has struck gold, I think it's fair to say, with the 8 he had. I think once Frankie got there, I was like, okay, 8 is a very strong crew, there is enough, and of course we have Vivi waiting on the side, but they needed a shipwright, they needed a new ship, and Frankie is a personality that I think really has a great dynamic with Robin. He could really interact in a fun way with people like Usopp or Luffy, and he fills in the gaps really well in terms of chemistry and overall entertainment and character writing. Now, adding immediately, an arc later, a character to that, we'll see how it works out, because he's at the end of Thriller Bark, Brooks has just entered, being a proper part of the crew. So we'll see how that goes. But I just want to say it's a really bold move to continuously want to shift and tool things and be willing to change things up when it's a formula that is well received. Now, I mentioned the highs, I just need to say it again, the highs were amazing. The Laboon twist, how it goes and integrates with Brook's backstory and Zoro stuff, the best Zoro moment so far, as well as one of the best backstories so far. It is in the conversation for the best backstory in the series. It was maybe not necessarily because of the actual writing, because I think maybe the Skypiea flashback and the Robin flashback might have it beat in terms of pure writing, but the presentation here, the way that Oda went in between past, present, and deeper into the past, we'll talk about it when we get to it, but it was brilliant. It was a masterwork. I was so moved and taken aback by how much it affected me. Now, with regards to the themes of this arc, there is some really interesting subject matter. This arc brings to the fore the idea of the afterlife. We see through this that there is an afterlife in the One Piece universe. There is the concept of the shadow or the soul. There are spirits. This isn't something that I don't think this was confirmed prior to this, so that opens up a whole host of thematic possibilities and world-based, setting-based possibilities. And with regards to it, there is a great focus on the sanctity of life, what it means to live, and having a respect for life. We see it a lot with Chopper and Hogback. We have a great theme of, kind of in the same way that movie 6, Baron Omatsuri, contrasted Luffy with someone who couldn't stand to lose his crew and the madness that can spiral from that. We see that with Gecko Moria, so it's a great thematic antithesis to Luffy, or not even an antithesis, but rather a foil. This is an example, a cautionary tale of what happens because Luffy has not lost anyone. He has gone to hell and back to keep all the members of his crew, but what happens if he does? When he stakes everything on his crew like this, in a similar way to Gecko Moria, you must not lose yourself if the worst happens. Now, I'm gonna come out with it. I don't think that One Piece will ever have a crewmate die, let alone an entire crew, but nonetheless, this is such an interesting way to add sympathy to Gecko Moria, to add layers, and to show he really, at one point in his life, may not have been too different from Luffy, and that just really makes the story that much richer. And then as well as this, there's a great amount of build-up for the new world. We got introduced to it before, but there are several things throughout Thriller Bark that help to build it up, kind of similar to the way that East Blue built up the Grand Line as things continue to ramp up. So that's a really cool theme that was tied into here too. There's some great world stuff, Kuma and the position of the world government and the warlords. This arc had a ton packed into it, and I'm aware that I said it could have been shorter. I still think it could have, but nonetheless, I have to give Oda credit because there is a lot here, and it all feels relatively cohesive. Now, with regards to the cover story, it is a doozy. We have NL, who continues to search out the fairy Verth, the moon. He continues to explore the moon, and he finds all these, like, automaton otters. They look like otters or little animals, and he's able to power up this army that seem to take residence on the moon. He finds some hieroglyphics that might have some bearing on where he came from, and through these really interesting drawings, as he's just kind of observing them, you see these figures in these hieroglyphics of these stories that were told for past generations of people that looked like Skypians, Shandians, and we hear the name Bilka, this moon city that people apparently escaped from during some sort of war or conflict or something to get onto our planet. And it bears mentioning that NL is said to have come from an island in the sea called Bilka. So really interesting stuff in this cover story for Bilka, the most complex cover story for sure so far. And I cannot wait to see where it goes. I'm sure it'll have relevance in the foreground of an arc in the future, so really looking forward to that. I have some ideas kind of swimming around in my head, but nothing super concrete just yet. So we start right at the beginning of Thriller Bark with the crew just kind of fooling around, having a great time, just general hijinks. Some of them are relaxing in the Thousand Sunny, they're really checking it out, they're exploring it. It is a great ship, Frankie did an amazing job, and they're really just having fun throughout it. And it's lovely to see, especially in contrast to the end of such an emotionally charged arc. That contrast that Oda loves implementing is very clear here. However, they find a barrel that seems to be an offering to a sea god, they bring it on board, and then some flare shoots out of it. Seems to be some sort of trap or something. And then a really gothic looking ship comes into view with someone singing. And the first thing I thought here was, Luffy wants a musician on his crew. I mean, here we go. I did not expect it to be a literal skeleton with an afro, but that's what we got. That's what happened. And I mean, what can I say? It's Brook. This is his introduction, and it's really kind of drilled in right here, he's very lonely. We don't get the depths of that loneliness until later with the backstory, but it's very clear he's been alone for a long time. He makes that clear, and the eccentricities of his character are shown to us right away. You can read in between the lines and see that this may be the result of him going slightly mad in this loneliness, like I alluded to. He makes these bone jokes that are, they verge on, they're charming at first, to me. Then eventually they get, they wore on me, for sure. But I don't really think that's a flaw with the character or a problem with it, because that sort of exhaustion that I felt as he kept doing these unfunny bone jokes, it really drills home just the nature, the profundity of the depths of his loneliness, as he just needs to try his best to go reach out to these people and try to make them laugh no matter what, to have some sort of connection with them, so they won't abandon him, so he won't be left alone. And that is very sad. So in the early parts of the arc, I was just kind of rolling my eyes a little bit. It did take a little bit away from my enjoyment, and I was just kind of like, okay, another bone joke, all right, I would kind of skip over it a little bit. Now with recontextualization, I look back at the bone jokes, and there's a sad tinge to them, a very integrative, in-character reason for them being there, and I don't imagine that they'll go away, because you can't just shake that off. And so I think that'll help me going forward to look at them with a different perspective, and enjoy them more. Brooke definitely had, I think, the weakest start to any Straw Hat's introduction to the story, because of these things, and because the full scope of his character and who he is isn't revealed to you until the end of the arc. So it's by design, but it definitely took me a little bit to warm up to him properly. But at the end of this first chapter, Luffy just asked him, I find you interesting. He's this skeleton, he has this weird backstory, he's a musician, and Luffy just finds him really interesting and can kind of sense intuitively that he's a good person, and he says, join our crew. It's really funny. All hell kind of breaks loose. Usopp and Chopper are scared of him. They're trying to ward him off with some sort of talismans and stuff. It's generally good fun, and all the crew are against it, and I see where they're coming from for sure. And here he kind of imparts upon us the kind of bare bones nature of his backstory. We hear that he ate a fruit, a bone fruit? Revive fruit? Yeah, so this fruit, revive fruit, revive someone upon their death. And he ate it when he was just a regular person, when he was just a pirate, and all it did was prevent him from being able to swim. But he was part of a group of pirates that were killed. Again, very, very dark subject matter, a hint to this tragedy. And then after he was killed, he wandered looking for his body as a spirit because of this revive fruit. When he eventually found it, his body was all bones. And so when he came back into it, this is how it ended up being. So it's a really interesting explanation for why he is this way. He isn't a classical zombie. It's an interesting mix of the devil fruit powers and what happened to him, and to also skip ahead a little bit, his shadow being snatched earlier. All these things combine to make a character who seems like they could just be some sort of weird undead zombie, but who isn't. It's just an interesting mix of a few things that coalesce in a way that makes him seem like a classical zombie, or a classical revived skeleton, even if he isn't. So I thought that was cool. And Oda is very adept in telling us here that the terminology for whatever he was when he was revived, as he was looking for his body, you could call that the soul, or the spirit. As he was searching for his body, it took him a year to find it, but that's a separate thing from his shadow. A certain man, we know to be Gecko Moria and Hogback and their whole shtick, stole his shadow and have been keeping it, and he wants to get it back. And that's the reason why when they hold up a mirror to him, he has no reflection, he has no shadow, which only adds to the mystique of the character. But again, there's an in-universe logical explanation for that combined to make him seem more scary than he actually is, which is just cool. I might be the only person in the world to find that cool, but I was looking at that and thinking about that and went, that's very smart. And I think Brook is a great example of the tonal identity of a lot of this arc. Like I said, maybe the first half, because he has these horrifying things that have happened to him. He is this embodiment of grief and loneliness, and yet he screams for joy. He shouts for joy at being able to share experiences with other people. He is so willing to crack jokes, and there is a sad tinge to it, of course, but that is just part of who he is at this point. So this juxtaposition between the light and the dark with Brook is so emblematic of the tonal juxtaposition of the arc as a whole. His experiences seem hellish, he seems lonely as hell, but he's able to be nonetheless goofy and silly, and look at life with some optimism. but he can't join the Straw Hats because his shadow is taken, and so he can't go out into the sun or else it'll disintegrate. So Luffy says, I'll get it for you, and they go out, they set off to get his shadow back. And so they go onto Thriller Bark, this floating ship of an island that just looks beautiful. There's some great aesthetics, great architecture. There's some parallels to, like I said, kind of Soul Eater stuff, to Tim Burton-esque aesthetics. There's also some Victorian era looking Bloodborne-esque, Soulsborne-esque architecture that I find really, really engaging. For anyone who doesn't know, Bloodborne is one of my favorite pieces of fiction in anything. So anything that's adjacent to or reminds me of Bloodborne, I automatically have an adherence to that. But yeah, Thriller Bark looks awesome, like I alluded to before. Now, the Coward Trio, my goats, Nami, Usopp, and Chopper, they go out, they take a launch to go onto Thriller Bark, and their voyage takes place on this mini Going Merry, this shuttle that Frankie put together as a tribute to the Going Merry and what it used to be, and it's really lovely. And so they go on that and they're having fun, but then they accidentally end up landing on the actual island. I love the idea of the mini Going Merry, and I think it's a great show, as if we needed an explanation, or as if we needed another example of Frankie's empathy and his compassion and his understanding. But so yeah, this trio are on this haunted island. In the meantime, with the crew, the rest of the crew on the ship, Robin suddenly gets sexually harassed by this invisible ghost person thing, which we know is Absalom, that ends up licking her. The trio get into hijinks on the island, and they find all these interesting looking creatures and zombies. Some of the designs here are great. They're chased by a Cerberus, and they eventually end up at Dr. Hogback's mansion. And Chopper instantly recognizes the name of Dr. Hogback. So they enter Dr. Hogback's mansion, and they're introduced to Dr. Hogback, who is Chopper's idol, because we all know Chopper's relationship with life. He thinks that a life worth living is beautiful, that life is sacred because of all that's been imparted to him from Dr. Hiraluk, and he looks at Dr. Hogback and his experiments and what he's doing, and he sees a man who seems to be trying to extend human life or revive human life so that people can live for as long as possible. And he thinks of that as a beautiful thing. He looks at it through his idealistic lens. But Dr. Hogback is sugarcoating what he's doing. He's not telling the full truth. And because of Chopper's situation, I think it's a little bit, maybe unintentionally, but nonetheless predatory to getting him onto his side. We also see Sindri, his assistant, who is clearly a zombie as well, who has a hatred for plates. And so we see her, Dr. Hogback, talking a little bit about his research, and it really just, it seems off. It seems fishy. Chopper can't really see it. Our characters don't get the extent of it just yet, I don't think, but it really feels off, and something is wrong here. They dwell on the idea here, the theme of there potentially being only one life to live. Is reviving someone against the natural order of things? Should you go against the natural order of things, or does that really matter? What even is the natural order? That sort of thing. And I think it's really smart to have these sorts of themes being dwelt on after an arc in which they have to say goodbye to a crewmate, the Going Merry. It's interesting, it's integrative. But after this, Nami begins taking a bath, Usopp and Chopper are outside kind of taking watch, and Nami is straight up assaulted while taking a bath here. This was painful to read. This was just awful. Now, of course, you can have horrible people in stories. You can have sexual assault in stories, and it can be done in a way that is tasteful and well done, as long as it properly punishes the person doing the sexual assault, or in some way shows and condemns them and shows that what's going on here is not to be taken lightly. It is serious, it is wrong. There has to be something in the story that indicates that this is something that should be approached with the proper amount of tact and weight and seriousness, because there are people all around the world. I've heard stories from women primarily, but all women, men, non-binary folks, whatever. There are stories from people all over the place who've had their lives ruined because of sexual assaults, who have gone through these experiences and had their lives ruined, or it's just been horrible. So just as is the case, for example, of a character murdering innocents should be treated with the proper amount of respect, and that they shouldn't be moralized to be a good person if they do that, I think that a scene like this in which someone is being sexually assaulted should be treated with the appropriate weight, and it just isn't here. Throughout this chapter, after this stuff happens to Nami, there are jokes, there are allusions to Usopp and Chopper, primarily Usopp being embarrassed by Nami's naked body, and there's slapstick. The tone is all off. I'm not saying that it's wrong for Oda to have put a scene that involves sexual assault in this way in his manga. This is fiction. That is totally real-world issues like this, dark issues like this, are totally fair game to be put in stories, and tons of my favorite stories involve this sort of thing. But it's not good if it's done in a way that doesn't properly respect the horrifying nature of what's actually going on. I think dark subject matter like this, horrible things happening to people, should be treated with the appropriate weight, and it just isn't here. And that's pretty much the long and short of it, and I don't like the scene. I think it's very bad. It's maybe the worst chapter of One Piece because of this. So Absalom is an awful character. He is, because of this sort of thing, it's just like, get off my screen. Yes, there are people like this who exist. Yes, he is a villain and he's supposed to be hateable. I get it, but because of the way in which his villainy manifests and the way that it negatively impacts my enjoyment of the story because it's just so tone deaf and isn't given the appropriate weight, it just makes him a nuisance. I just want him off my screen. I don't want him anywhere in the story. But we move past that, and Luffy and the rest of his crew weigh anchor on the island, and they start traversing it to get to the other three and to get the Shadow of Brook. And it's funny, the Cerberus that was chasing the coward trio earlier, Luffy and company are able to sort of domesticate it and tame it. And there are all sorts of creatures on this island. It's crazy, it's really creative, and really enjoyable. We then get a little bit of a scene where Hogback, Absalom, and Perona discuss the Straw Hats and their plans for them and what's going on, and it's very ominous, and you can tell very bad things are afoot. In the meantime, Usopp, Nami, and Chopper find themselves being attacked by the literal mansion that they're in. The paintings come to life, the mansion starts attacking them, it's really dangerous, and it kind of spirals out of control, and the true face of Thriller Bark shows itself to them. They eventually make their escape, and they come to some room where they see Sindri without the stitches and stuff across her face, showing that she was once a regular person, as I mean, it's common sense, but they see a picture of her here. She was beaming, she was smiling in these photos, and she was very much alive. Now, how does that coalesce with what we know about her now? So in this room that shows all these pictures of Victoria Sindri, which is her name, in her former life, the Straw Hats here, the trio here, kind of put together what's going on, and Chopper begins rethinking his opinion of Dr. Hogback and what he's actually doing, what Thriller Bark is. And they pick up where they left off after this, and they're chased throughout the mansion. It's pure chaos. The other Straw Hats make their way throughout the island. The other Straw Hats make their way towards the mansion as well, and there's some funny gags where Luffy, he sees these zombies and he thinks that they're just old men with injuries, and then they come up to an actual old man with injuries, and the others think that he's a zombie, and he's actually just an old man with injuries. But this guy tells him that someone named Gecko Moria is behind this all. He's the one who is the root of all the weird happenings on this island. He stole Brook's shadow, and he is one of the 7 warlords of the sea, which makes this immediately affect the world outside this. Even though this might have felt initially like this mini arc that is super isolated in this one small story, no, this will have implications on the world outside as well. So this warlord of the sea, Gecko Moria, has clearly taken an interest in them, and I guess the overriding question is why? And they continue towards the mansion, and they continue on their way, trying to, kind of curious about why, and we'll see why in a bit. And it is, I mean, I'm jumping ahead a little bit, but the reasoning for this is genuinely quite emotionally resonant. Meanwhile, the coward trio see how these monsters get created. It's very Frankenstein-like, and Absalom starts rising zombies out of the ground, or these soldiers out of the ground. We get introduced to Perona, who seems to be able to have these negative ghosts, which can take on the crew, and it's all sort of kicking off and building up into some sort of grand battle. It's pretty hype. And then in the midst of this, Gecko Moria wakes up. He seems to be very focused on the Straw Hats and very gluttonous and a little bit greedy, and yeah, he gets introduced here properly. Also, Usopp, Nami, and Chopper find a zombie that laughs a lot like Brook. This is Ryuma, someone who would end up being like pretty much one of the most memorable characters in the arc, mainly due primarily to cool factor, rule of cool, his dynamic with Zoro, and his dynamic with Brook as well. Two really cool dynamics, which is, you know, well written. But most of all, I just looked at him at first and looked at him throughout and just went like, this guy is super raw. Like, he is really, really just genuinely cool. He appealed to that sort of 12-year-old in me who just likes seeing cool designs, cool fighters. Yeah, he looks great. And he's explained to be a warrior from Wano, the Wano country. And just to be clear, I haven't been living under a rock, so I do know that the current One Piece arc, or the One Piece arc that just finished, a really long one apparently, that's been going on for at least a couple years, is called Wano. So that's one of the few arcs in the future that I know the name of, but so knowing that Ryuma is from Wano is interesting. And he goes after our trio, and they end up escaping. He's very strong, but they try to evade him. In the meantime, Sanji gets separated from the rest of the crew, and they kind of just let it be, not because they don't care about him, but because they're confident that he'll be able to handle whatever it is he's come up against. And there are some nice lines here from Luffy about how he has to save his friends. As we know about him, it isn't new information, but it always tends to hit. Like I alluded to, Absalom resurrects these generals, these zombie generals. They all look really cool. I don't have much to say about them, but their designs are really great. They reminded me of, again, Soulsborne bosses. Here we get also introduced to this plotline with Lola, who is this zombie boar that is in love with Absalom, that Absalom, you know, he's into Nami and wants to marry her, and so she's jealous of Nami, but then Nami fools her into thinking that she is a trans man. It's a subplot for sure. I don't really have strong thoughts on it either way. It just kind of passed me by a little bit. Lola has some great lines, which I will allude to later on. But this whole plot line, it was kind of a miss for me. Not that it was bad, I just didn't really care about it. Actually, if I didn't care about it, maybe it was bad. I don't know. The other Straw Hats, Luffy and them, continue to traverse, and they find this dog that's also part of a penguin crew that says that he will never kick a woman or hurt a woman or something like that, exactly like Sanji. Sanji's gone missing, this dog is talking like Sanji. I think it's clear what's going on here. And then in addition to this, Zoro disappears just like Sanji did. This leaves Luffy, Frankie, and Robin to search for the remaining members of the crew, and Luffy's wearing armor for some reason. It's generally pretty funny and silly. Like, what is this guy doing? He is like a kid in a toy shop. Whenever he's in an unfamiliar new place, even if the stakes are high, he just loves discovering things, and he's very adventurous, and I really like that about him. I don't think it really took away from the severity of it, because it's been well established that he has confidence in them, and yet still has to go and save them. I was fine with that. But then these three come up to a zombie general who talks exactly like Zoro. He says the things that Zoro said in the past about scars on the back are a swordsman's shame. So Zoro's soul has clearly been transferred into this guy. They catch Luffy. Luffy's kind of just lumbering around, and Frankie and Robin are left to pick up the pieces, and there's a hilarious line there where Frankie's just like, because Luffy's wearing this armor, he can't tell the difference between him and just the regular soldiers. I just laughed at that. I thought it was pretty funny. We see this new spider zombie called Tadaran. Really grotesque, really good design, I thought. It was one of the better designs in this arc. And it was at this point in the read-through where I said that, you know, despite the Straw Hats have taken on the world government, and they've been able to take on all sorts of challenges that would seem to be more intense than these. Partly due to the fact that these creatures are Frankenstein monsters that are immortal, more or less. And also due to something I can't really actually place, it never felt weird or artificial to me that Luffy and friends were having trouble with these enemies. It felt to me like this unfamiliar situation would no doubt bring about this sort of difficulty. So I could understand how some could say, like, wow, how do they take on this world entity and then have trouble with these sorts of creatures? You have to look at a bunch of things. Like, the stakes, again, are not quite as high, and that means that they're not quite as finely tuned or performing at their optimal level. But they're also just things that I can't even articulate that really kind of sell me on it, where I was just like, yeah, okay. So that never really bothered me here. I saw it a couple times in chat, and yeah, it isn't something I really thought about. I don't have a problem with it. During this segment, Frankie and Robin are very rock and roll. They're very go, go, go. they're doing a lot of the heavy lifting, and they're awesome while they do it. Robin has this really cool wing power now, which I'd never seen before. She's able to sort of fly for a few seconds using these hands that kind of erupt out of her body and using them as makeshift wings. It's pretty cool. But ultimately, Frankie and Robin end up having some difficulty, and they have to be saved by Brooke, who just comes out of nowhere and dispatches of Taradan, this spider thing. And we hear that he is some notorious humming swordsman. He is fearsome, notorious, like I said. And what's funny is that, he crashes in, and he also crashes into the ground, and his silhouette, as he crashes into the ground, very cartoonish, captures his afro. He said before he had strong roots, so I guess that's true. And in the meantime, the Coward trio make their way into some sort of zombie body to listen in and eavesdrop into the plans of the higher-ups on Thriller Bark. Back to Brooke and Frankie and Robin, he explains some more mechanics here. He says that the shadow, I think I referred to it as the soul earlier, can be separated from the body and planted into another body. When that happens, they take on personality traits or sayings or bits from the original owner, while having the combat ability of whatever body they've gone into. And it can be a short, gradual assimilation where they finally sort of come to terms with who they are subconsciously and end up organically adhering themselves to the body. Gecko Moria is creating this army of zombie soldiers. He had a bounty of 320 million before he became a warlord. And so this army is fearsome. This is a huge problem because Gecko Moria has eaten a devil fruit that allows him to separate shadows from bodies to create these armies. For what reason, we'll get into in a bit, but the thing is, when you do that with bodies, with corpses, soldiers that are very fearsome, it's a deadly combination. And what is Hogback doing? He is making these soldiers, so they are in trouble. They have to combat this right now. Now, in the meeting with the higher-ups from Thriller Bark, we get some of this motivation from Gecko Moria, where he reveals that he wants to become the Pirate King. Just like Luffy, he wants to become the Pirate King, which I didn't assume initially. It really doesn't seem like these sorts of things he's doing would be contributors to that. But no, he does want to become the Pirate King. And that is a bit of a look into this guy's mind a little bit. Him and Luffy have this one shared aspect to become the Pirate King. And he's creating these really strong zombie soldiers as a means to that end. Military might. Meanwhile, Luffy's shadow is taken from him, and it's not going well. Now, Brooke explains a little bit more, which is that if the original, so the soul or the shadow and the body are inextricably linked. If the body dies, the soul disappears. And sorry, I keep calling it soul. I might do that. You know what I mean. So if the body disappears, the shadow is gone. And so as a result, their methodology is to ship off the bodies away from Thriller Bark, keeping them alive though, because they can't kill them. Brooke also reveals that the weak point of the zombies is salt. He then explains a little bit more about his past. Some horrible event happened, and he was the only survivor on his ship. He survived. They were defeated. They fought, but they were defeated. He ran away. And so he says that he needs to escape Thriller Bark because he has a pact made with a friend. And then they cut the conversation off right there in a hell of a tease. This is something that really makes Frankie cry when we come back from that cut, and very understandable knowing what it was that he told him. Brooke comes face to face with Ryuma, who has his shadow, and at the same time, Gecko Moria and all decide that Luffy's shadow will be injected into this subject number 900, this huge hulking behemoth whose name is Oars, who ends up being a pretty primary antagonist for this, at least in terms of an obstacle. And it was this point, chapter 457, where I kind of said to my chat that all this stuff really reminds me of Paper Mario: The Thousand-Year Door. If you played that, chapter 4, the nature of shadows, souls, them being tied to bodies, them being extracted and put into other bodies, the whole thing reminded me a lot of that, which I thought was just generally, it's always been a cool concept to me, and I like that they're exploring it that way. And the themes that are associated with it, like we talked about before, are genuinely pretty substantial, like the nature of the soul, how it is tied to your body, but how it can adapt and ingrain itself into a new body. It can be ephemeral if separated. Some pretty philosophical things at play here, and it isn't dwelt upon super a ton, because that isn't really the main thematic core when it all comes down to the climax of this arc. But the way that Oda touches on it, there's lots of interesting ideas there. Now, Chopper, with Nami and Usopp, is looking on to all of this and sees what's going on, and he says, yeah, he's just playing God. This is unacceptable. This is disgusting. It's against the sanctity of life. And he's completely just horrified by what Gecko Moria and what Hogback are doing. And he is just so disappointed, given what he thought of him before. No intention of actually saving people. Just using this for nefarious, selfish means. But then they're confronted by Absalom, who dispatches of Usopp and Chopper and takes Nami away for their wedding. Frankie and Robin come in and save Usopp and Chopper, and they all kind of discuss what to do next. In the meantime, Oars, who has Luffy's soul, is kind of taking on some of his traits, his stubbornness, his reckless nature, his hot-headedness, his hard-headedness. He doesn't want to listen to Gecko Moria, so his soul clearly needs to work into being obedient. Brook and Ryuma continue to fight, and Brook alludes to this importance of his afro. Now, at first I kind of raised an eyebrow at this, and I was just like, is this going to be another, like, long ring, long land, memeing about afros? What is the importance of this afro? Why does he want to keep it so much? And when I thought about it more, I went, looking into the nature of Brooks and his perspective and what he's gone through, could it be that the hair being the last remnant of what he once was is something that he deeply feels tied to? Does he want to keep that semblance of his former life, of what he used to be? In which case, that would be very profound, very emotional. Turns out that's not the primary reason, but I do think that even if it's not in the text, that could be a factor as well. It's a very human nature-esque thing to do. But Brook and Ryuma start dueling to win back Brook's shadow. And these sorts of ideas really kind of nail home again that theme of the nature of the soul, and how that ties into motivations and dreams. These are things that seem to carry on beyond the physical body. This sentimentality, this sentimental core with regards to dreams and ideals and whatever, this emotional core is something that is rooted to the human soul. And that's something we could have guessed before, but it is literally shown to us through what Oda shows us here. We have bodies separated from shadows, and those shadows being injected into other corpses, and those people, these new beings, touting things that are so clearly tied to what the ideals were of the former person they were. Zoro, scars on the back are a swordsman's shame. Sanji, I will never hurt a woman. I don't know the nature of that specifically just yet. Like I said, I think we'll get into a Sanji backstory in the future, whatever, but it's clearly tied deeply to his character, and so that's quite interesting. Dreams can live on through these shadows. But the crew go to find the kidnapped people, the kidnapped crew members, Luffy, Zoro, Sanji, all of whom have had their shadows extracted. And Usopp says, hold on, this is great. He says, there's a beautiful female swordmaster carrying a lot of meat. Wake up. Applying directly to each of their interests, which was great. Now, this is where we see throughout, in and out of Brook's fight with Ryuma, and interspersing with Luffy's dialogue and Zoro and Sanji now talking with the crew, now that they're mostly reunited, minus Brook, I guess, and Nami, we find that the friend that Brook wants to see again is Laboon. And I spliced in my reaction to that earlier. You guys saw it. That was one of my favorite moments in all of One Piece. Just the ability to bring back that plot element 400 chapters back, almost. It's incredible. Oda never forgot about Laboon, and it was such an emotional concept just in Reverse Mountain, and tied into the Straw Hats' ideals and Luffy's, the draw of Luffy as a person, and why he's such a beautiful person, and what he did for Laboon. The way to bring that back right here is just genius. It was unbelievable. It's emotional, it adds a ton to Brook, it adds to Reverse Mountain as an arc, to Laboon, and so his promise was that they would come back to Laboon, him and his crew, after sailing around the world. Now, of course, we know what happened to them. They all got killed, and this happened to the only remaining member in Brook, and he got marooned on Thriller Bark. He's stuck. He's been stuck for ages. He's nearly gone mad with loneliness. And so is Laboon, crying out, screaming for their crew. 50 years. It's been 50 years, and Brook and Laboon have been separated. What immense plotting. What great integration of elements from the past into future elements and laying foundations to be brought back. You know, it's a very genuine possibility that he hadn't planned this out when he wrote Reverse Mountain. But regardless of what happened, it is extremely impressive either way that it's able to come into this, to come back into the fold like this. And now, one of my most anticipated things in the whole series is Brook meeting Laboon again. I was already anticipating the crew meeting Laboon again. Now I can't wait to see Brook. But so Frankie reveals this to Luffy. Luffy goes, yeah, we need to help this guy out. And they all set out to, empowered further to get their shadows back, to save Brook, to save Nami, everything. And this is why Brook wants to keep his afro, because it is his only distinguishing feature. He is now a skeleton, and the only way that Laboon will recognize him is through his afro. It's so good. It's so good. It adds so much emotion to Brook. He slowly becomes more and more impressive as the arc goes on. And so now we see why he fits in with the crewmates. This crew who all have this far-off dream, this abstract dream, this improbable but not impossible dream that they will gun towards until the end. This is his dream, to see Laboon again, to sail across the rest of the world, back around again, and see his dear friend. So their goal here is to beat up Gecko Moria, make him return the shadows, and all will be well. Brook can leave with them, they'll have their shadows back, they'll get Nami back, everything. But they have to do this before dawn, obviously. But as they make their way towards it, Perona's negativity ghosts come up, and it leads to one of my favorite lines in the series, genuinely. It's hilarious. These negativity ghosts make the people they come into contact with extremely disheartened, depressed, whatever. So it's like a little bit of a gag. It came up to the characters and they're on the ground and they're like, oh, what's the point? And we see Sanji and he says, and I quote, "My eyebrows are so curly, I wish I was dead." I laughed my ass off at that. I don't really know why. It was just, I lost my shit. Meanwhile, the adventurous Luffy's soul inside Oars begins exploring Thriller Bark, climbing on buildings, looking around, like our Luffy does. And meanwhile, Absalom and Nami's wedding starts. Oars also crashes down and kind of disrupts the Straw Hats as they're going towards the manor to rescue everyone. They kind of have to scatter as the chase continues, and Robin and Chopper, they fight Hogback and Sindri as they tell Luffy to continue on. And Chopper here really tells Hogback he's lost respect for him, he's not a doctor, he doesn't have any respect for life, and it's really good him standing up for himself and his ideals here, and it's one of the better Chopper moments throughout the series. It's really good. And I think this lack of respect for life, being a very key theme for Thriller Bark, it just makes sense that Chopper is a primary character here. A bridge gets broken, and Frankie builds a bridge, being the shipwright, and he's very self-conscious about the design. It's a funny gag, tying his character motivations and character role into just progressing here. It was really good. But then Perona uses her negativity hollow again to slow them down, and it works on everyone except Usopp. Because, as he says, I am already extremely negative. And so it's generally obviously funny. It's humorous, it's great, but it also, again, does something that I was really hoping this arc to do, which is reinforce the utility of Usopp specifically. Show things that only he can do and the ways in which he contributes. And we got a lot of that throughout Enies Lobby and Water 7, but now that he's back officially part of the crew again, I wanted him to be able to not necessarily redeem himself, but just reiterate why he's so valuable to the crew. I really wanted that this arc, whether it be emotionally, spiritually, thematically, or in this case, he's already extremely negative. He's already very scared all the time. He's already very glass half empty at a lot of times. So Perona's negativity does not work on him, and he says, "Hands off my crew," which is just lovely. I love that. And so it's Usopp against Perona, and he's able to sort of outsmart her. I won't get into the nitty-gritty of the fight, but he is able to outsmart her and save the crew, essentially, which made me very proud. Some moments I loved was Usopp says to her, "When it comes to being negative, no one can beat me." And these onlooking zombies, sort of slapstick zombies, are going, he's proud of his negative character trait. Brook, during this time, loses to Ryuma, but Zoro and Sanji come in, and they're able to help him, and Zoro challenges Ryuma. And he says because his sword was destroyed earlier, he'll take Ryuma's Shusui, I believe it was called. And slowly throughout all of this, Oars Luffy begins going back and drifting into the Oars role. He's becoming less Luffy, less independent, and kind of more of what Moria wanted him to be. So he starts to think to himself that he needs to take out the Straw Hats, the people on these wanted posters, which is what he is using to identify them. Oh, and sorry, one thing about the Usopp fight that I didn't mention is that throughout it, with the fight with him and Perona, it's such a great fight. It's such an encapsulation of who Usopp is at this point in time. But throughout it, when he's up against the wall, he finds the motivation to call upon Sogeking, this part of himself, and it totally helps him to feel empowered, feel more confident, and be able to think more clearly, to call upon the courage he showed as Sogeking in the past. And it's a compartmentalization sort of characterization here, but it's really, really effective and very, very genuine and true to life, and I 100% buy this for Usopp, and I think it's very useful. In moments in the future where he needs to call upon courage, I can see him doing a similar thing, and I think his goal is to integrate this courage to be something that is naturally a part of him rather than something he calls upon. But the fact that he can call upon it at all like this is a very big demonstrator of how far he's come. Sogeking was born from Usopp's insecurities. It is a reaction formation, an opposition to them, the ideal. But this fight helps him to turn his weakness being scared, his negativity, into a strength that actually makes him immune. And he calls upon this reaction formation in Sogeking, knowing that he can't hide behind it, but he can channel the empowerment it gives him, the sentiment behind why it was created, which is the desire to be braver, to be better, to be more courageous, and to protect his friends. It's beautiful stuff for Usopp. Meanwhile, Luffy encounters Gecko Moria and confronts him, and Sanji crashes the wedding between Absalom and Nami, and he's very upset because he says that he stole his dream from him. Absalom stole Sanji's dream from him. And this might be one of the worst chapters. I mentioned earlier that Thriller Bark had probably the worst chapter. This is in competition for it. This is chapter 464, where Sanji explains that how Absalom stole his dream was by eating the invisible fruit, or whatever it was called, that turns you invisible, because Sanji wanted that fruit himself so that he'd be able to become an invisible man and peep on women, to sneak into women's showers and see them naked. That isn't funny. It's gross, it's disgusting, it's harassment, it's an invasion of privacy, it is just scummy. It's so unlikable. It's an extremely unlikable trait. And not only that, he says, like, that was my dream, but now that you've eaten that fruit, I can't have it. So, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to find out ways to peep on women without the fruit. It's just gross. It's just not good. And the thing is, I'm all for characters having character flaws. This is a genuine character flaw. And you can have, obviously, if you look at my favorite protagonists or antagonists or whatever, favorite characters, so many of them are flawed people. Some of them are horrible people. They are not good people for many different reasons. Walter White. But the thing is, it's all well and good to have a character who has character flaws. And this is a character flaw that could be used in some way. But this sort of disgusting sexual harassment, this disgusting peeping on women in showers, looking at them naked, invading their privacy, it needs to be punished either in-universe, or the tone of it needs to show that this is not good. And obviously it's common sense. We don't need that to tell us that it's not good, but we do need it to be approached with the proper weight. Otherwise, there's just a discrepancy between how the character is treated, how they're portrayed and conveyed, and how we feel about them. Because some people in chat have told me that Sanji is punished for these actions. Not so far. The most he gets punished is onlookers doing these sort of slapsticky, angry faces, very expressive Oda reactions to, oh, he's so gross, oh, you perv, whatever. It isn't substantial. It isn't genuine punishment. It isn't. He is not punished in this story, and the tone is very humorous. This whole chapter is very humorous. This is played for laughs. And so it's just gross. If Sanji had said these sorts of things, and he was just looked at as pathetic, and the tone was just sad, like this is just a sad man with deeply rooted issues, or something like that, then it would have been different. Then it would have been effective, maybe. This is someone who needs to sort his life out, because this is horrible. And if the tone reflected that this is something that is horrible, that is something he needs to work on, and move on from, then that would have made him more engaging, more interesting, because I know that there isn't a discrepancy between how I view that sort of action and how the story does, and I think that sort of action should be approached with weight. But it's just played for laughs. It's just played for gags. And unfortunately, this chapter really made me enjoy Sanji less. Not significantly less. It doesn't ruin the character, but I definitely enjoyed him less. It just makes me enjoy him less. He's more unlikable, he has this horrible character trait, and the story doesn't acknowledge it as something that is horrible, which makes me feel a little alienated or a little bit of a whiplash. Anyways, I probably went on about it way longer than I had to, but just wanted to tell you guys why I don't like that. I don't think it's good, and it was unfortunate. Though it is worth noting that there is an element to Sanji's character in this chapter. It isn't a pointless chapter because there is a moment where he holds Nami up to this pedestal. He swoops in and saves her and doesn't want to get her dirty, and kind of self-sacrifices, self-sabotages him in order for her to remain perfect, pristine, letting himself get hurt if that's what needs to be done for her to remain pristine. So that's interesting. That is something that I'm engaged with, and it's interesting character work, and I think it's portrayed as something that could be a character flaw or nature of his character that could tie into his backstory. So that's something that I'm definitely keeping an eye on. The Zoro and Ryuma fight continues, and it's awesome. It's very bestial from both sides. There's flames all over the place. It's extremely raw. It's awesome, and there's camaraderie, or not camaraderie, but respect between the two parties. And Zoro ultimately defeats him, and he says that he's going to use his sword with honor. Brook gets back his shadow, Zoro gets the sword. He has immense respect for Ryuma, and notably, in a callback to Baratie, he did say to Luffy that he would never lose again. But he says, I have respect for you, Samurai of Wano. Great fight, I really enjoyed it. So we then go back to the battle between Chopper, Robin, Hogback, and Sindri, where Chopper kind of continues his monologuing or dialoguing this ideological battle of what life means. And he says that what you're doing is anti-life, what you're doing is a disgrace. It makes a mockery of what life is. She's moving and talking, but she isn't properly living, these zombies as a whole, because they're being forced to move. He says he doesn't consider him a doctor because of this. This isn't in service of life, this is against what it is. And we learn that Hogback is essentially someone who loved an actor named Victoria Sindri, and one thing led to another, found her corpse, was able to inject a shadow into it, and used this because he was in love with her. It's just pathetic. He dug up her corpse and revived her and made her into this obedient Sindri. Actually, I don't think specifics are given with regards to whatever shadow was injected into her, or if a shadow was injected into her. It's just said that he used his magic or his powers to resurrect her and make her obedient, because in life she was married to someone else, which got him very upset, because she should have been his, and then he did this. Just a heinous, horrible thing to do. And he says, well, look, she can move and talk, and Chopper says, humans need more than that to be free. And they begin to fight, but Sindri ends up being unable to move, and we see tears, or a tear coming down her face, showing that that sentimental core, that soul, is seeping through. Now, Robin and Chopper are then able to defeat Hogback, but Oars kind of storms in, and it seems that he is fully obedient now. Like I said, he's here to take out the Straw Hats. Absalom somehow takes Nami again. Zoro sees Oars coming and kind of grins. He is in his element this arc. He is just taking on all comers. There's some cool elements here as Luffy kind of chases Gecko Moria and confronts him, and the rest of the Straw Hats, minus Nami, I guess, take on Oars, and there's some really interesting bits of teamwork as well, which kind of elevates in a second. But right here in particular, chapter 470, there's a really cool little bit where Zoro is falling and Robin uses a net of hands to save him. A really lovely element, kind of harkening back to Enies Lobby in Water 7 of using this power that some would look at as horrifying to save her friend, which is really lovely, using it for good, as she always has, really. But Oars is just overpowering to them. There's some great art throughout of him, like a downward angle, looking up at him looking at like this hulking, monstrous beast. Great art. Nami and Lola are able to beat Absalom, because Lola kind of is over to Nami's side now. Like I said, isn't a huge amount of investment for me into that little plot line, but it is nice from Lola here. And then the Straw Hats continue to fight Oars. Minus Luffy, Nami, and Brook, I guess, but they take him on. They take him on properly. There's a great spread as they sort of squat up. And so they go, okay, how are we going to take this on? Usopp's very scared. He just says that he wants to leave because he's scared. It's great. And then they go, okay, let's go. And then Oars does like a sort of ground pound, butt stomp sort of thing, and they immediately run away. It's very funny with these horrified, like really serious wooden expressions like, oh god. They charge in really determined, he does that, and they go, Luffy doesn't do that, and then they run away immediately. It's hilarious. And then Frankie forms some sort of human mech, with Zoro and Sanji as the legs, holding him up as the torso, Chopper as the head, Usopp as one of the arms, and he's like, we're docking. And then Robin's the last one left, and he goes, dock with us. And Robin says, I find this embarrassing as a human being. And she says, don't ever ask me to dock with you again. What a queen. I love it. It's just genuinely hilarious, though. It's, one, that all the other members are doing it. They're accommodating Frankie's ridiculous request. And two, Robin refuses, obviously, because why wouldn't she? But it's done in a way, like, the tone is very much that she is not doing it because she's not a part of them. She's very much a part of them. And this humorous nature of it is something that we really haven't seen from her before. And after Enies Lobby, it's great to see her having these interactions with the crew. I would never dock with you, but yet she's still a part of this family. They're all a bunch of dorks. This elaborate, ridiculous, silly plan to take out Oars is so funny, and it's so, but they work together in a way that we haven't really seen before. They haven't had this sort of a plan this coordinated before, and I think that really kind of encapsulates the draw of Frankie. Frankie puts this plan together. It's very elaborate, like I said. It's very all over the place and convoluted, but it's fun. It's got this camaraderie, it's got these connections, and honestly, it's a sort of plan that only Frankie would come up with, and he directs the crew in only a way that Frankie would do. So without him there wouldn't be scenes like this, and I think it's a great encapsulation of who he is. Connecting people together, understanding people, being silly, being resourceful, and just all around being a great presence. And it works for a bit. They kind of knock him down. But then we cut to Nami, who's running, trying to catch up with the crew and understand what's happening, and then she meets, she sees Kuma, Bartholomew Kuma, who we got introduced to in Jaya, I believe, with Doflamingo. He's back, he's here, and this huge grand political player, this warlord, is here. And at first I'm like, wow, this is bizarre, but it makes sense. Moria is a warlord, he's a warlord, he probably has to be here for a bunch of reasons, which we learn, like the fearsomeness, just like Enies Lobby has been taken down and the whole world takes note of it, and it makes Enies Lobby seem less fearsome, which is very bad for their reputation and for how the pirates could be emboldened by this. Another warlord cannot be taken out by this crew. But Nami and Perona, Perona's with her, get shocked by Kuma, and Perona says, what are you doing here? And then he just asks her ideal vacation spot. Okay. But ultimately, he seems like he's interested in Luffy, Moria for obvious reasons, and he mentions Ace as well, just kind of in passing, doesn't touch upon it a ton, but Nami hears this and realizes that Luffy needs to know about this. And we see kind of Kuma's power here. He just touches Perona and makes her totally disappear. And then he also instantaneously teleports next to Nami when she's farther away. So he has some ability to teleport, warp space, maybe time. I don't know exactly, but he's able to do this to manipulate it to instantaneously teleport and teleport other people too. And during this, Luffy fights Moria's shadow, and is really ramping up here. They continue to fight Oars, and Usopp says, you know, if we beat Oars, then Luffy will get his shadow back, but if Gecko Moria is defeated, everyone gets their shadows back, so is this what we should prioritize? But Zoro says if nothing else, we have to make sure that Luffy survives, which would lead to a situation in which Luffy could potentially lose a lot of his crewmates, which is interesting because, you know, if we're thinking thematic foils, antagonistic foils, that would leave Luffy in a very similar situation to Moria, who lost his entire crew. Luffy would lose a lot of his crew members. Interesting. But we cut to Kuma again, who is with Moria, who explains to Moria that Blackbeard has been named the next warlord. Clearly it seems that he may have been victorious against Ace. But anyways, that information is a bombshell, and he is here to inform Moria that he cannot be defeated. Another member of the Warlords cannot be defeated by a Straw Hat. But he very much warns him, I'm not here to help you. I'm just here to tell you, to warn you. After this, Moria then appears from within Orz's stomach. Some weird sort of shenanigans going on here, and he tells the Straw Hats, and he says to them, if you can defeat Orz and then defeat me, I will return all the shadows. The Straw Hats then prepare to battle, and Brook comes in with some salt, and it's go time. In the midst of this battle, Luffy comes upon the original bodies of a lot of the shadows that have been stolen. He finds the original Lola, who has her own crew, and he learns about Moria's powers and gets a little bit of a cheat code into how he works. And the rolling pirates, who are Lola's crew, they imbue Luffy. They kind of just stuff him with a bunch of shadows of people, of capable fighters who have lots of negative feelings towards Moria to empower Luffy and make him stronger, but they kind of just shove it in there. It's kind of a little bit disturbing to see or to visualize in your mind's eye what's going on with Luffy here, because he just gets stuffed with all these souls, all these shadows. And in the middle of the fight with Orz, he is stretching, and it seems very akin to what Luffy was able to do, and the crew wonders, like, how's he been able to do this? How can he stretch like this? And Moria explains that he is able to change the shape himself by manipulating his subjects. He changes the shapes of the shadows, which makes him able to change the shapes of the body. So it just, similar to how a bunch of disparate elements came together to make Brook seem like some sort of zombie, a bunch of disparate elements come together here to make it seem like Orz is imitating Luffy when he isn't. So, kinda cool. But Orz one by one takes out the Straw Hats. Again and again and again, they're taken out. It looks increasingly grim. But then Luffy, powered up by these souls within him, looking like some sort of souped up, muscular, gigantic zombie. I think he was like greenish in color. He comes back to battle Gecko Moria and Orz goes to punch him and he stops it just with his fist. Amazing spread. Oda was going off with the spreads at this point in the climax of Thriller Bark here. Lots of very dynamic, very variable spreads, great use of color in the color spreads as well. It's all just great presentation. And Luffy here, it said that he's called Nightmare Luffy. Once again, he has all these hopes of all these different people pinned on him. They all want their shadows back. They all want to be able to see the sun, to be able to travel, to live their life again, for time to start again for them. And it's so much responsibility on one guy's shoulders, but as always, Luffy takes it on. He doesn't shy away, he's courageous, and he smiles at this burden, quote unquote. He doesn't look at it that way, and he never has. And the fight continues, and it seems that Luffy beats Moria, and the shadows will be returned. It turns out this doesn't get rid of Orz, and the Straw Hats need to come together to make some sort of gigantic team attack to take him down properly once and for all, and all that. And they finally do, and it's a lovely moment as they're able to collaborate once more. Again, this teamwork is... there's another level to it that we haven't seen prior to Frankie joining, which I think is really cool. And Robin says throughout this, they use, as part of their strategy, they use the zombies' inability to feel pain. And Robin says the zombies' inability to feel pain is their own weakness, because pain lets you know that you are being hurt, that you are being damaged. Without pain, we wouldn't be able to reflexively react to environmental stimuli that are dangerous. So zombies not having that is obviously a flaw, a problem. And it's poetic that they use this against the zombie, because the logic behind them in the first place was that they would be immortal. But they use that immortality and inability to feel pain against them, which is very cool. And I think it ties in with Moria as well, because he didn't want to feel pain himself, and as a result, he creates these zombies. Well, I guess we're talking about his motivation now, in order to be surrounded by connections, the connections that he lost, the crew that he lost, because he is lonely. He is wrecked by grief and agony and pain. He lost everything, and he has cracked as a result of it. Thematically, he's just an amazing foil for Luffy, because we have this person who wants to be the Pirate King, who wants to take on the sea, or wanted to in the past, but lost his crew. Luffy would do anything to make sure that his crew stay with him. He did that this arc. He's done that consistently in the past. And same with Moria, but he lost them, whereas Luffy has them. Moria is trying to bring back those he has lost, in a sense. He's trying to bring back the feeling and trying to avoid his loneliness or compensate for his loneliness through making this army of invincible zombies just to surround him with empty company. But there is no love here. There is no camaraderie. There is no connection, no true connection, because he's using them as tools to make him feel better, to make him fill this void in his soul. And then he wants them to get together and form this crew, and he wants to be the Pirate King, his original goal. And it's such a twisted inversion of what Luffy wants to do, just a villainous inversion of it. And who knows, who's to say that Luffy wouldn't crack if he lost everyone? But also, a difference is that Moria wants his crew, his soldiers, to do the vast majority of the work, whereas Luffy leads from the front. Now, maybe that contrast is because of what happened to Moria as well. Hard to say, but there's so much richness that can be implied, that can be gotten from the subtext. But if he has been this way the whole time, if he's been a bad leader and maybe only realized the connection he felt towards his crew after they were gone, my god, that is incredibly resonant. And the true, up until this point, I was kind of like, okay, I had seen people talk about Moria as an underrated antagonist, and someone who was very well written, and someone who was great for the series as a whole, and for a foil to Luffy and all this stuff, for some of the reasons that I've just said. But up until chapter 480, I didn't really see exactly where that was coming from. But 481, it all clicked. Moria is still alive, and he starts absorbing all these shadows in one final struggle. There isn't really any huge intent here other than an outlet for his grief and loneliness and what's been taken away from him. And that is powerful. And what I mentioned earlier about Lola having some great moments, here she is able to stand, not hide from the sun which is rising as the Straw Hats take on Moria. But here we see Moria in full. And there's one panel in particular which is very sad. The expression here from Oda, the illustration is amazing. He looks deranged, but he doesn't look deranged in terms of just pure insanity. He looks like he is broken by grief and torment and agony, and he is just living this sad existence that is a shadow, pun not intended, of what he wanted to do all his life, and it was taken from him. And so he just goes through these motions in a way to somehow feel what he wishes wasn't taken from him. He's a lot like Baron Omatsuri from movie 6. And in this way, he's sympathetic to me, to see what he's gone through and what he does in response to it. He is a sympathetic character. Obviously, horrible person doesn't mean that I justify anything he does, and he deserves everything, but he still has these sympathetic layers. And he is a cautionary tale, a warning of the worst case scenario of what could happen to Luffy, or any pirate on the Grand Line. Moria, as morning comes, Moria is completely just wasting himself with this power. He is burning himself out, and they just have to wait it out, the Straw Hats. And what's crazy is Moria could have just waited for Sun to hit. But in this final struggle, he just needs to express this. Maybe subconsciously he needed to be put to rest, who's to say? And he's just cracked. He sees this example through Luffy of a crew that is everything that he wished he still had, and he just cracks with the grief, the envy, and all that he went through. And Luffy does Gear 2 and Gear 3 combined, and deals a huge blow to Moria as the sun rises and people start to disappear. But ultimately, Luffy's able to defeat Moria in time, and the Straw Hats kind of reflect on what happened, and Usopp is worried, genuinely concerned, and he says, there's a great moment where he reflects on Luffy's recklessness and says, how long can he keep going like this? I wonder if Luffy's recklessness will be punished or examined further or deconstructed, because he's continuously done this. He's continuously bared the burden of all these hopes, but can he keep going like that? Can he? Is he really built that way as they go further and further into the Grand Line and the New World? Or will he have to be questioned and examined? And Usopp kind of thinks here, how much longer can he go? But before he can really dwell on that, they're interrupted by Kuma. And he says, for the world government, he must destroy the Straw Hats. And he says, I will start with Roronoa Zoro. This climax to this arc is insanity. It is absolutely insane. And we see that Kuma has the Paw fruit, and he's also some sort of human android to a greater extent than Frankie. He's a literal android. He's able to do much more than Frankie can. Like, he's part mech. But he has this Paw fruit, which is characteristic of him given that Kuma means bear, and he's just overpowering all the Straw Hats. And what he does here is he builds up this bomb, and he says, hand over Luffy to me, or else this bomb will detonate, and you'll all die. And they all say no, and it detonates, and it is pure catastrophe. And it's lovely that no one's willing to give up Luffy after all that he did for them, as they should. But this bomb just goes off and it is carnage. The scenes are horrific. And Kuma walks up to Luffy to obtain him, to grab him. But out of nowhere, Zoro, still conscious, defends him. And Zoro says here, Luffy will become king of the pirates, and we will be there for him to carry that out. His dreams are our dreams, and he will achieve this. And Zoro here, seeing that Kuma is what he is, begs him, essentially, you want a life? Take mine. It's not as important as Luffy's, but I am a Straw Hat. I am strong. And just take mine. Which is crazy because when he joined, he said that he'd kill Luffy if Luffy got in the way of his dream. But now he's willing to die himself if Luffy can carry on his dream. Again, the theme of ideals and dreams being more important than the physical life. And also the theme of protecting one's friends, protecting your friends' dreams. He is living for so much more now than he ever was before. And this is, I think, the best Zoro moment, the best Zoro chapter, 485. But then, in one of Sanji's best moments, he comes out of nowhere and says to Zoro, they just have this connection, right? He sees that Zoro is giving his life up and he says, no, don't you dare. I will give myself up. So he's doing the very same thing that Zoro's doing, giving up his life for not just Luffy, but for Zoro, this person that he has such a connection with. And they bicker and they argue, but they have a connection unique to anyone else. And he gives himself up. He gives his life up to sacrifice himself for Zoro here. And Zoro refuses to do that, so he knocks out Sanji, but before Sanji is knocked out, he has this very tender grab of Zoro's leg, and you just feel the connection they have here. The real deep down connection. Underneath all the bickering, all the competition, these two have a bond that is unique. And it was a really tender moment of connection between the two. Sanji was willing to give his life up for him. Zoro did not want him to do that. But Kuma agrees he won't take Luffy's life. And instead, he'll transfer, using his power, all the pain and fatigue that Luffy would experience into this ball and transfer it into Zoro. And he says to Zoro, you're gonna die. Like, you are not gonna be able to survive this. But he says, you got it. Luffy won't die as long as you take this. And Zoro accepts it. He steps into the ball. And then we get a cut and everyone's unconscious, passed out, but Sanji wakes up, panicking, knowing what would have happened to Zoro, and he goes to Zoro, and he sees him covered in blood and wounds, but standing tall, standing proud, and it's such an image, as we see Zoro just arms crossed, having embraced all the pain that should have killed him, and he's still alive, and Sanji says, what happened? And Zoro says, nothing. Nothing at all. Nothing happened. And that is obviously very raw, badass, all of that. But it really sticks out to me how far Zoro's come. The lengths he's willing to go to sacrifice himself, not just for Luffy, not just for Sanji, but just in general. That he's willing to do this is beyond powerful. I can't put into words what he did here. And it is one of the best moments of the series. It's the best Zoro moment. And it really made me feel an enhanced appreciation for him. He will bend over backwards. He will do all that he can for the crew. And him saying nothing happened, like people pointed out to me in chat, which I agree with, is so key because it's just his job. He doesn't want recognition. He doesn't want people to congratulate him. He doesn't want Luffy to know that he experienced all this pain, and Sanji agrees as well, as we see later. It's just his job. If he can sacrifice himself for his captain, what good of a first mate is he? And some have pushed back on my use of the term of quartermaster earlier on. I'm not using the modern word for quartermaster. I'm looking towards the traditional, classic, hundreds of years ago term for it, which is explained in the Black Sails wiki. I can link that as well. So I'm not going to stop using quartermaster on occasion. Sorry if that bothers you, but I've explained myself. That's why. It is accurate using the definition I'm talking about. But nonetheless, back to the moment, that is just his job. He doesn't want recognition for it because it doesn't deserve recognition. That's just a crewmate's job. Like he says, who would I be if I wasn't willing to die for him? And Sanji felt the same. Amazing moment for Zoro, primarily, but huge stuff for Sanji as well, and their dynamic in general. Now, in the aftermath, the Straw Hats celebrate. There's the classic celebrations, but the dust settles and Sanji is concerned about Zoro, and he makes it clear to these other pirates who witnessed what happened, don't tell Luffy. It would make him feel pain knowing that he caused Zoro such pain. And during this party, the crew ask, wow, we get to what is honestly somehow an even bigger peak than nothing happened, as the crew ask Brook to play a song, Bink Sake. And Brook tells Luffy that he has a dream that must be fulfilled, and he explains to Luffy about Laboon. And Luffy explains back to him their experiences with Laboon. And he says that he's still alive, and Brook is overcome with emotion. And he reminisces as Luffy just listens and grins and takes part and experiences this. And it's very reminiscent to me of when Sanji was telling Luffy about the brilliance and majesty and the joys of the All Blue. And he just listened, and he sat back, and he took it in. Nothing more than that, just being present and taking part in the joy of this, of all of this. And then Brook launches into a backstory like none other, and words cannot do this justice. As I alluded to, the presentation of this was out of this world. The best structuring of a backstory for sure. As we go from the present and the party, and we go back in time, and then even further back in time, and we see Laboon after all has been taken from him. So lonely. But then we also see his past experiences. Sorry, I said Laboon, I think I meant Brook. But we see Laboon being first attracted to the Rumbar Pirates, which is Brook's crew, and they're celebrating in their raucous music, and he was one of them. Laboon was one of them. And they try to get him to return back to wherever he came from because it was dangerous, but Laboon just kept following them. And it was a struggle a little bit as, you know, they tell him, you have to stay, but he didn't stay, and he kept going with them. He became ultimately a member of the crew over time. But they had to leave him because he couldn't go past the red line, as we know. And so they left him with Crocus for the past 50 years. And then we get to the additional time skip / flashback element that I was alluding to as we go forward 3 years from when they left him. So 47 years before the story, I guess. Brook is just alone as a skeleton on his ship. There's nothing there except corpses. He sees skeletons, his ship is destroyed, and he recalls and reminisces. And you wonder, how did it come to be this way? And it so smoothly and efficiently flows between these time periods. It brings up memories of the times they had together when Brooks walks past one part of the ship. He remembers a memory from that part of the ship. It's so emotional and well done. And the puzzle starts to slowly fit together. He builds coffins for his crewmates. And he'd reflect on the good times, and he'd reflect on when he would think in the past of how Laboon is doing. We see that his captain, Yorkie, had an incurable illness and died, and he tried to leave the Grand Line through the comm belt, just sent off. And there's this huge emotional moment as he entrusts the crew to Brook, and it's so emotional. Yorkie had to leave them, Laboon had to be left behind, for all these reasons that were outside of their control that broke apart this family. And it was here where I thought, like, this disease that Yorkie has, it seems pretty reminiscent to the disease that was on Kalgara's island in the Skypia flashback, or as well that Nami got prior to Drum Island from Little Garden. But we cut back to him on the destroyed ship, and he's just silently singing to himself the song that represented their good times, just spinning the wheel, quietly singing it. The pain here cannot be properly articulated that he experiences. I cannot even begin to attempt to feel what he felt, and I never want to feel 1/100th of what he felt. And we see what drove him to the borderline madness that he experienced. We see why he reaches out and tries to, through these jokes, get people to like him, to connect to people because of this loneliness that he experienced. He was alone for so long, but he continues to have these flashbacks. He recounts his crew dying, and they're all poisoned, they're all dying, they're all on the verge of death as they sang out one last time Bink Sake in celebration of what they were, of what they became, of their voyage. Even though it is to end here, they want to sing this for Laboon, for themselves and for Laboon, who they regretfully haven't been able to return to. And they want to put this performance into a sound dial to keep their promise to Laboon, in the hopes that someday it will make its way over to him. Wow, it's getting me a little bit wept up here. And the lyrics are fully shown. I won't say them here, but they were quite beautiful. And I heard the anime version of this is beautiful as well. I can't wait to watch that. And the way it flows, again, we talked about the tonal whiplash of this arc. It flows again between this celebration in the present with the crew to the celebration with his dying crew to the loneliness. And there's just horror and desolation everywhere. But then we go to the present and he has this new family, this new place to belong, and no one deserves it more than him. He deserves this new lease on life. He deserves to be part of this crew that accepts him, this new family. He deserves to move on and to be eventually reunited with Laboon. And he resolves that, okay, I'm gonna see you once more. I'll finish my excursion as I promised, and I'll make my way over to you in just a year or two. And it really hits home here. I thought in Reverse Mountain, and I think the crew thought as well, of Laboon's crew who left him as nameless assholes, for lack of a better term. People who didn't care, bad people. But this shows that it was the total opposite. They never stopped thinking about him. They cared so much about him. But they had to do that. And now I can't wait for Brook and Laboon to meet again, for Laboon to hear the song. And he says that the sounds of the performance from the sound dial, that is what kept him going. He was so lonely, but in the end, he's glad he was able to live for this new family, to be able to meet Laboon again, and to carry forward the legacy, again, inherited will, every crewmate, into the future. And that it's awesome. It's awesome that in spite of it all, he still wants to live and he still wants to go on adventures. And his dream to find Laboon, it is very much in sight. And so he formally asks Luffy to join. And I'm going to talk about my character rankings in a bit, but this backstory, in and of itself, and how it all coalesces, shot him right up. What a character just through this. I'm still kind of stunned at it. But we then cut to Crocus and Laboon, who, Crocus says here, well, you're in a great mood today, as Laboon seems to sense beyond the horizon what's going on out there. That his best friend is out there, and he will make his way back to him. We then have a bit of a funeral for Brook, lamenting the passing of his crewmates. He has all these graves and he's praying. And Zoro comes and he prays for his fallen sword, the sword that got destroyed. And he asks Brook if he can do this, and he says, of course. And it's a lovely moment of respect between the two, as Brook kind of recalls Zoro's faith, as he remembers that he said Luffy will become king of the pirates. And it's interesting how Oda uses Brook, because Brook is a skeleton. He can't really have a huge amount of expressiveness, but nonetheless, it's a sort of face that is drawn in a way that you can impart the emotions that he is feeling to it, kind of in the way that, bit of a bizarre reference, but C-3PO functions in the Star Wars films. An emotionless face, but that can be, it's a type of face that's designed in a way that emotions can be attributed to it. And I think the same is true with Brook. But so they all start to head out, and Luffy says Fishman Island is next. And Lola then says to them some huge news. She gives Nami a Vive card, and she says that these will come in handy in the New World. Her mother gave that to her. It's a kind of way of two people to remain in contact. I think there's an element of it being able to guide them towards each other. I'm not too sure. I think that might be explained more, or maybe that is just it. Either way, she gives her this Vive card, and then we see that, wow, the piece of paper that hundreds of chapters ago Ace gave Luffy is a Vive card. Luffy attributed importance to it just because it was Ace that gave it to him, but it's a good thing that he did, because it is genuinely very important. And he takes it out and he sees that it's smaller and it's burnt. It's burning. And Lola says that that means that that person, their life is at risk. So Ace is in danger. And last we saw him and Blackbeard fighting, and Blackbeard's now a warlord. It doesn't look good for him. But I really hope that it isn't the end for him, because we've gotten hints at his role in the story, and we know his role in the story with regards to Luffy, but I really want to get to know him more, so I hope he doesn't die too early. That would be a bit disappointing. I hope we get to know more and more of him, but I mean, the fact that this is out there, Luffy thinks about it and he says, you know what, Ace will be fine, and he doesn't feel in that big a rush, which, you know, he knows Ace better than anyone, and he knows the capability of people close to him better than anyone, so fair. So maybe his confidence is well-founded, but we'll see. Nonetheless, the way this plot element comes back from hundreds of chapters ago, in the same way Laboon did, Oda was going off with the plotting in Thriller Bark. But the Straw Hats finally leave Thriller Bark in earnest, and we go back to Marijoa, and Kuma is kind of criticized for letting them escape. Garp is there, and he's kind of laughing genially at Luffy's antics. Sengoku's unhappy and says that Luffy should have been executed, and they're worried about the reputational element of this as well. Garp says that Luffy isn't the kind of person to sort of tell all that he sees that I defeated a warlord. That just isn't him, so maybe it won't be that bad, but nonetheless, this is a huge blow. And again, I love how Oda keeps bringing forth this nature of reputational problems, because that's a huge thing. That's a huge thing. Reputation is a huge part of the power, because power is a shadow on the wall. It's an illusion. It is where people believe it is. If people start seeing through these brittle masks, they'll be able to rise up and take down the government. So this is bad for them. But then, as Oda tends to, again, plant seeds for future arcs, well in advance, Kuma says that because he's screwed up here, the Straw Hats are heading closer to Marineford. Now, that's crazy because the next two arcs, or the next two islands that we know of, they want to go to Fishman Island, but to do that they have to go through the Sabaudi Archipelago. Like I said, I've read a couple of chapters of that, not much, but enough to know that that's what's going on here. So those are the next two islands, I assume, and yet Oda is going maybe 3 islands ahead? Maybe more? Well, there's also Impel Down? The amount of establishment and foundations is out of this world that Oda is setting down here. But we go back with the Straw Hats, they are on their way to Fishman Island, and who gets washed up but Kami, this mermaid who is part of Hachi's stories, Hachi's cover stories, that comes to fruition here. And again, a great example of why paying attention to the cover stories is essential to the story of One Piece. You lose so much if you don't do that. But before this, they come up to the Red Line, and it's just great to see the progression from Log Town, or just after Log Town, when they first came up to the Red Line. And if you compare side by side the panels or the illustrations, how far the story has come, and how far they have come, and how far Oda's art has come as well. But that is where we end off with this sort of cliffhanger. Thriller Bark, what an interesting arc. Like I said, I've gone through it all. You know, some of the low parts of the series, in terms of content, some of the biggest flaws of the series, but at the same time, so much greatness there. Some of the peaks of One Piece, the highest highs, the lowest lows, and it's so interesting in that way. It has so much to say, like I said, touches on the nature, the ephemeral nature of the soul, and the sentiment of dreams with regards to the soul, and the ephemeral nature of the soul, and how that can apply to the world building of the series, and also the themes associated with what it means to be a crewmate as portrayed through Zoro, what it means to lose the connections that you live for as a pirate, as you try to carry out these grand ambitions as Moria did, and that cautionary tale for Luffy. So many great themes addressed here. Someone said, I don't remember who it was, but at the end of the arc, when Luffy fought and defeated Moria, someone said, thanks for bringing back the sun. And that just reminded me of Skypiea, as he brought forth the sun after that storm, that torrential, apocalyptic storm. That is what Luffy consistently does, and he does it again here. He brings forth the sun. And I talk about Moria, to jump back for a second, being a foil for Luffy, but he's also a contrast to Brook, because Brook lost his whole crew, right? Brook lost all of that, and yet he didn't fall into despair. He held on to those memories, hoping for something better to come along, holding on to this dream, and that was his saving grace. Moria gave in to despair. Brook did not, and he was rewarded for it, and I think that's key. Anyways, honestly, I thoroughly enjoyed the arc. I would have to give this, honestly, a light 8 out of 10. Yeah, I think it deserves it. Despite some of the lows, the highs, and the overall package, the art was great. Some great plotting, some great moments, great characterization. Moria is such a fascinating antagonist. Yeah, Thriller Bark to me is a light 8 out of 10. And so if we get to the character rankings, Here we go. Just to spout off a few, we have Ace, Doflamingo, and Garp, characters like that. They're very interesting, but I need more before I can say that they have enough substance to be an honorable mention. Maybe Blackbeard as well. In terms of the honorable mentions, we have characters like Gecko Moria, a great addition to it. Sir Crocodile, Koza, Polly. I've got a few too many honorable mentions at the moment, but, you know, let me just list them all off for now. We'll narrow it down later in a future video. But there's also Zeph, Calgara, I think I said, Iceberg, Lucci, especially after the AJP's comment from this video, Spandam. Great character. Mary, Mihawk, Hiraluk. But then if we get into the top 15, this is what we've got. So for the actual list, number 15 is Shanks. Number 14, there's been quite a bit of a shuffle, not for any reason apart from me just really kind of having to reflect on what this ranking is and changing things around with regard to my emotional connection to the characters. So number 14 is Chopper. He did go lower, not for any reason. I don't like him less, but I just think I gained a greater appreciation for some other characters upon reflection. But he does have some great things in Thriller Bark. I still like him a lot. I mean, he's in the top 15, and this cast is huge. So, you know, Chopper number 14. Aokiji number 13. Number 12 would be Frankie. Number 11 would be Smoker. Come back to me. 10 is Noland. Number 9 is Wiper. I'm still really riding for these one-arc characters. They're awesome. Noland, Wiper, they're great. But right up to number 8 is Brook. That backstory, he goes straight into the top 8. Sanji's number 7, Vivi is number 6, number 5 is Nami, and number 4 is Zoro, number 3 is Robin. But I do have to say, with Zoro's strides for this arc and my increased appreciation for his maturity and his role as a quartermaster, first mate, whatever, it's so close between Robin and Zoro. It's nearly a tie. Then Luffy is number 2, and Usopp is number 1. That is my top 15 for this segment. The end of Thriller Bark, that's my top 15 characters of One Piece. Now with all that said, thank you so much for watching this video. It's turned out to be longer than I thought it would at the outset of the arc, but nearly 50 chapters, so much to discuss with regards to all sorts of different parts of the story, and I hope you enjoyed. Thank you so much for watching. If you would like access to the next video review, which will be of the Sabaudi Archipelago arc, you can do so by subscribing to my Patreon. If you want to follow me on Twitch, where you can watch me go through every single arc live, and the VODs will be there for 60 days, so you can catch up on those as well. You can follow my Twitch, link is in the description and pinned comment. You can also join the Discord server for updates about stream stuff, video stuff, all sorts of stuff, and discussions with like-minded One Piece fans and just anime fans in general, even if you don't like One Piece. Don't know why you'd be watching this if you don't, but nonetheless. That's all for this video, guys. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Many thanks, and hope you're having a great start to the year.